Yeah, I'm going to put it on our Combined Authority YouTube channel and send the link out. Okay, let's make a start. Thank you, everyone. Oh, that's not a good start. Thank you, everyone, for joining. It's really good to see you all here today. We're just going to make a start. We are expecting a few more people to join, but let's do the intros to start with. My name's Helen Foreman from West Yorkshire Combined Authority. You probably, hopefully, already know me or have worked with me. And I've got with me here today Dr. Anna Barker from the University of Leeds, who led the piece of research that fed into this guidance document, and Stephen Hayward from the Yorkshire Sport Foundation, who's a bonus today, who's going to talk about his Yorkshire Sport Foundation's research into a similar topic, but with a slightly different set of criteria to do with sport and activity rather than the safety, which was the focus of ours. And we thought they aligned quite well, and it would be useful to kind of make those connections across the patch. So welcome, everyone. We've got an hour and a half, so it's a good long time. We've got Anna and I starting with our presentation and a little bit of time for Q&A. And then we've got Stephen and a little bit of time for Q&A after his as well. So if you feel that need to take a break, then it's probably better to do it in the Q&A bits. And if you have questions that come up during the presentations, just pop them in the chat and we'll deal with them during that Q&A session. I've also put a link to feedback form in the chat. I'll just put that in there again, but that's just to help us make these webinars better. We are doing quite a lot of them over the next few weeks and months, and so we want to kind of make them as useful as possible. So if you've got time, please feed that back. I'm recording the session so that anyone who hasn't had a chance to attend can look at it on our Combined Authority YouTube channel, and I'll send that link out along with the slides if you would like them. Let me know. And what else? Please mute if you haven't already. If you haven't in 3 years learned the learn the conventions around muting, please do that, but it sounds nice and quiet at the moment, so that's great. I think that's probably it. So what we're going to do is provide in Anna's and my presentation, we'll provide a brief outline of the research on women and girls' perceptions of safety in parks before then giving an overview of the guidance that came out of that, which we've called Safer Parks, Improving Access for Women and Girls. I hope that you've heard about it, but you might not have done. So sit back and have a listen. The research was undertaken by a team at the University of Leeds in late 2001, and we then had a partnership with Keep Britain Tidy, Make Space for Girls, and ourselves, Combined Authority with the University of Leeds, to produce this Safer Parks guidance document. So Anna and I are going to share the presenting this morning of this document. Anna's going to go first, and then I'll chip back in. We'll to and fro it so that you don't get too overwhelmed by either one of us. So over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Helen. So I'm just going to start with a little bit of national context, actually, and a little bit of regional context into why we feel that this needs addressing. So I really want to focus here that concerns about safety is one of the biggest barriers to women and girls using and enjoying our parks and green spaces. And this is a graph that's come from statistics from the Office for National Statistics, and it shows that across Britain, women feel less safe using parks than they do using other public spaces like residential streets, busy public spaces like high streets and train stations, and on public transport. So parks stand out as an area that need looking at. But it also draws into stark view the gendered inequalities in perceived safety in parks. So again, it shows at a national level, women are 3 times more likely than men to feel unsafe in parks during the day, and after dark, 4 out of 5 women, so nearly all women in Great Britain, said that they felt unsafe in parks, compared to 2 out of 5 men. Still high and still an issue that needs to be addressed. And this reflected what we found in the West Yorkshire region with women and girls. So they, out of the 117 women and girls we spoke to, 1 in 5 said they felt unsafe or fairly unsafe in parks, and 97% said they felt unsafe after dark. So to bring that into perspective, what this means really is that it limits women and girls' use of these spaces, of these really important spaces that are obviously key to our mental health and well-being. This same Office for National Statistics survey said that 37% of women had stopped using parks as a result of feeling unsafe, particularly after dark. And it's important to note, whilst there's a kind of strong temporal dimension here to sense of safety in parks, this doesn't just mean nighttime. It was very much important through our research that, you know, women and girls going about their daily activities, going to school, going to work, or coming back from school and work in early mornings and late afternoons in autumn and winter months, when it gets dark as early as 4 p.m, that this was affecting their everyday activities. Next slide, please. So again, in relation to this context, this obviously has issues around women and girls accessing these spaces in terms of their concerns about safety. They told us that they were restricting their use of parks, sometimes choosing to walk in busier areas rather than green spaces, avoiding them at certain times or when alone. And obviously this has an important impact on the lives of women and girls, their ability to socialise, participate in outdoor physical activity and exercise, and improve their well-being. And this impact starts early. So there is a known nature connection drop-off for teenagers and teenage girls. So it's a really important issue to address. And we feel, next slide please, Helen, that this kind of context needs to be looked at, and it needs to be looked at from the perspective of women and girls themselves. So what do women and girls feel would make parks feel safe or less safe spaces? What do they think from their own perspectives and lived experiences can make these safer spaces for them to use and enjoy? And that was the focus of our research. So we spoke in depth with 67 women and 50 teenage girls from across the West Yorkshire region, so in all of the different districts of West Yorkshire. And we also spoke to 27 professionals, those who manage parks, design parks, police parks, to get their views. Next slide, please. So where did we start? So our kind of central question was, what makes a park feel safe or unsafe, in order to understand this better from the views of women and girls. So we started with looking at what the existing literature is telling us. And we identified on this slide, as you can see, a whole range of potential factors that can impact women and girls' perceptions of safety in parks. The colour system doesn't mean anything, by the way. But there were broad societal issues here, things like sexist attitudes towards women and girls, so things that weren't necessarily in the parks themselves, but wider societal pressures and issues. You know, do they affect perceptions of safety? Harassment, as well as personal experiences of crime. To things like park design, the lighting that's available, the sight lines, thick vegetation, number of exits, presence of other people in the space, and all different types of other people, whether that's men, women, teenagers, those who are drinking, to temporal factors, or to things that might make them feel safer, like visible security, CCTV staff. So there's a whole range of things that could impact, and we wanted to find out what was really important to women and girls' perceptions of safety. So we used an approach called Q methodology to identify, out of all these factors, what was important to women and girls. And also, in particularly, are there factors that women and girls agree on? So are there areas of consensus or agreement that might kind of pattern a way forward to make parks feel safer? And are there things that they disagree on that matter to some women but not others? Next slide, please. So what we did is from all those different factors that we got from the existing literature, we turn these into a short set of statements like familiar parks feel safer, I would feel safer in parks if there was lighting, CCTV doesn't make parks feel safe. So we turned these different factors into a series of short statements that women and girls and professionals also ranked according to their own subjective views on safety. And obviously, women and girls are experts on their sense of safety. We're constantly navigating our local environments according to our fears and insecurities and so forth. So they know, reading these statements, they have kind of initial views on, yes, I return to familiar parks, they feel safer and so forth. So you can see here there's a grid in front of you, and women and girls ranked these statements on this grid. So at one end, you've got statements that were most like their view, that made them feel safer or less safe in parks that they strongly agreed with. And at the other end is statements that they disagreed with, that didn't shake their perceptions of safety. And as you go into that bigger group of statements in the middle, it's ones that they felt more neutral about. But what we're focused on is the two ends there, the two ends of the spectrum where it was either really important to their sense of safety or not. So we spoke to 117 women and girls, and we found that there are different views. We looked at how these statements were placed, and we found clusters of women who placed the statements in similar ways. We found 3 clusters, which show to us that women and girls have different viewpoints on what would make these spaces feel safe. They have different views and different preferences. For instance, some interventions like lighting mattered more to some clusters of women than they did to others. But what I wanted to get across here is that we also found a high degree of agreement amongst women and girls as to what could make these spaces feel safer. And I'm just going to talk through 5 key areas that have then gone on to inform the guidance. So the first is we think about, what is the top rated thing that all women and girls agreed on that would make these spaces feel safer? And it's the presence of other women. So we are a positive signal that parks are a safe space. So this was the areas of greatest consensus. So other women are a positive signal of safety, and they also serve to foster this kind of positive feedback loop, encouraging other women to use the park. So, the single best thing then can be done to make parks feel safer is to design and manage these spaces in ways that are appealing and welcoming to a diverse cross-section of women who will then use the park, be encouraged to use the park, who then will also serve as a positive signal to other women that it's a safe space. Next slide, please. The issue is that women and girls were telling us in interviews, once they'd ranked the statements, they were speaking to us about why they'd ranked them in different ways, is that they were telling us that whilst the presence of other women signals safe space, parks could be better designed to meet their diverse needs and interests. So if we take the example of toilets, toilets don't necessarily have a direct relationship with safety, but they meet the needs of women and girls, and their presence, therefore, of women and girls signal this kind of positive safety. So we've got these direct and needs that need to be met in order to, as well as safety, bring women and girls into these spaces. And they also told us quite often that some of the provision in parks, particularly place-based sporting provision, caters more for men and boys' interests. Next slide, please. So that was the strongest area of consensus, and this was one of the second strongest areas of consensus, and it was that well-used parks feel safer. So busyness, activation is really key in creating a park that feels safe to use for women and girls. And it was seen as particularly important for women by the women we spoke to, because it was when they were on their own or isolated, there were less people around, they felt less safe. So some women were talking about planning and scheduling their use of parks at times when it was busier, avoiding them at times when there were lulls in park use, coinciding their visits, during when they knew regular activities were taking place. Even if they weren't partaking in those activities themselves, there was the presence there of volunteers, bystanders, and so forth. So the other area of consensus on this slide was that organised activities, so actually taking part in organised activities, also made it remove these kind of personal safety barriers to getting the benefits of parks, like taking part in running groups and so forth. So as this quote says, it's a great way to still be social, to be active, but if I was to run around on my park, I'd feel that on my own, I'd feel less safe. So organised activities could extend the times of use of parks for women, encourage them to use these spaces and derive benefits from them. So that was an agreement from women. Next slide, please. So a key thing that came out as important in our research was that women and girls are constantly scanning their environments. They're constantly scanning them for signs of safety and for signs of potential threats, thinking about ways they could escape a potentially difficult situation. So women and girls really want the designers and managers of these spaces to start to see them through their own eyes and to understand what would make them feel safe or unsafe. So safety walks are a good way of doing that. But in terms of what we found, being able to sight lines are really important. Being able to see a good distance, but also be seen, have that kind of passive surveillance is really important. Keeping vegetation well maintained along paths in particular. For teenage girls, plenty of exits were important, and girls actually felt safer around the edges and the perimeters of these park spaces. So where they felt it would be there was more surveillance from the street and so forth, but also easier to escape. And girls were really concerned about being trapped in spaces and actually being able to escape them. So other spaces in parks, like multi-use games areas with the high fences, limited exits and so forth, whilst also seen as male-dominated environments, were also seen as spaces that either weren't inviting, but also could be trapped. And then women and girls, familiarity was really important. So women and girls spoke to us constantly. Their kind of safety work involved returning to familiar parks. So they felt safer in parks that they knew the layout, the direction of paths, where the exits were, maybe where they could seek help, and the busier times, the less busier times, and so forth. So familiarity actually was really important for them. So some of the girls talked about familiarization visits to these spaces, making it as part of their routine activities with schools and so forth, inducting them to these spaces. And then lighting after, so there was really broad agreement that these spaces don't feel safe after dark. But there was disagreement as to whether lighting could change this. So for some women and girls, they didn't feel that they could use these spaces because they wouldn't feel safe after dark, even if there was lighting presence. But for other clusters of women, the lighting was really significant and as something that would make a change for them in terms of their sense of safety. Not just lighting, but also using lighting to encourage the presence of other people. So they talked about active travel routes that they'd used during the day and they'd felt cut off from after dark. So thinking about how these spaces work with lighting and activity. Next slide, please. And then ways of getting help was really important. This matters a lot to women and girls. So once you're in the space, knowing either when staffing are going to be there, seeing signs of visible staffing, the presence of other people, volunteers, help points, these types of things signalled that where to get help in case there is an incident. And just these quick interactions with park staff, a nod, a quick hello. As you can see, some of these comments here, they just impart that sense of reassurance, and as this woman said, would make me run around the park again. And some women and girls in particular, talked about the importance of a gender balance in park staff, in the parks themselves. So having women who work in the parks or police parks mattered a lot to them for a variety of reasons. Next slide, please. And then it's difficult to underscore the importance of this, but women and girls do have different experiences and different identities, and these things mattered a lot in terms of their sense of safety. So young girls were particularly thought about it. Their sense of what they expressed was a physical vulnerability against older grown men, signs of religion, like a headscarf often made women feel more vulnerable, thinking that this would be that they're more at risk of harassment in these spaces, or that other things, that they'd be less able to escape from a potentially threatening situation. So we need to ensure that we're engaging with diverse needs when we're designing these spaces. Next slide, please. So what I think our guidance speaks to is that there's a lot can be done in terms of the design and management of these spaces, but women also want to underscore, and I know we're focusing on design and management here, that there does need to be this wider societal shift. So it needs to go hand in hand with attempts to change male behaviour, you know, whether that's in the classrooms or male behaviour change programmes. And there needs to be the kind of removal of this burden on women to avoid spaces, to stay safe. It needs to come from the design and management so that they feel able, confident to use these spaces. I'm going to hand back to Helen to talk through the guidance principles.
Thanks very much, Anna. A really good grounding in the research there, and you'll see as I start to work through the principles that we've outlined in our guidance document, how those influenced what we wrote. So here's the guidance document on the left, Safer Parks, Improving Access for Women and Girls, and we published this in May this year at a conference at the University of Leeds. It's also got an executive summary that goes with it. It's just a 4-page document. You can read it in 5 minutes. And so that's really useful if you don't have much time, or if you want to influence people who don't have much time. You can wave that in front of them, and it just sets out the summary of the document, the principles and and how we got there, and it's a kind of really useful start. The guidance itself, we're very lucky and privileged to have it being accepted as supplementary guidance to the Green Flag Award programme, which some of you will know about. That's the benchmark standard for the management of parks and green spaces across the UK and around the world. And it provides the guidance document provides these principles and a range of case studies for park managers, design professionals and other audiences to create parks that feel safer and more welcoming for women and girls to improve their access. So please read it and share it widely. I'll show you where to get hold of a copy later in the presentation. But really, kind of now that we've got the guidance, the interesting work starts in trying to implement it. So here's the steering group on the left. It was made up of the University of Leeds, Keep Britain Tidy, as I mentioned, ourselves, and the campaign group Make Space for Girls, who you may have become aware of. They campaign for greater and better access for girls to public parks. It was funded through our mayor, but using Safer Streets 3 funding, which comes from the Home Office, which is at a strong focus on safety. So that's why we've focused on safety principles in the parks. We were also very interested in creating more interesting and better parking, more attractive parks, and ones that make everyone more active, which is why it's been great to keep in contact with Stephen on this, and for the 2 guidance documents to work hand in hand to address different issues. So while we were writing the guidance, we consulted a huge number of people and organisations, and we're very grateful to everybody who fed into the guidance. Some of you will be on the call. Obviously, the views of park managers were central to it, but we also spoke to landscape architects, planners, academics and specialists in different areas such as lighting, organisations working directly in women's safety, friends groups, policing, designing out crime officers. The names are on the right, and obviously there were a lot of opinions, and not all of which necessarily follow the same alignment, but we've tried to reconcile those opinions, those differences of opinion where they exist, and to recognise the reality of the very difficult context in terms of funding, staffing and resources, and reflect just what's realistic within parks. We also had a very strong focus on making the guidance easy to read and access, and not using any jargon if possible, but making it the most easy thing to read if possible. So hopefully that you'll see that reflected in the graphics and the language that we've used. So We developed a set of 10 principles early on, and these were informed by those women's and girls' views and lived experiences. We grouped them under these 3 key themes to help keep things simple, and 3 is a very good number when you're writing things like this. So first of all, we have Eyes on the Park. That's our little tribute to the urbanist Jane Jacobs, if you've heard of her, but if you haven't, that's another webinar for another time. But she wrote about how safety in public spaces is fostered by constant mixed activity and what she called natural proprietors watching over an area. So whether that's park staff or just other users in the park, it's really crucial to women and girls' sense of a safe park. Awareness is the second theme. That covers the design of the park and how it can make women and girls feel safer by enhancing their ability to see and be seen, escape and navigate their surroundings easily and intuitively. And finally, inclusion is equally important, about making women and girls feel that they belong in a park, that they're engaged with how it's created, and that everybody across a wide range of intersectional identities feel that the park is theirs and for them. So here are the 10 principles under the 3 themes, and I'll go through each of them briefly. There is naturally some overlap between them, but what we tried to do is create a coherent sense of why the principles are there and configured them in a way that we hope people will be able to remember them, so that when people are thinking about parks, they've got a framework within which to think about all the different things they can do. The first principle is busyness and activation. That aligns to what Anna has been saying about the presence of other people making parks feel safer. And women and girls felt particularly safe in the presence of other women and girls and would schedule their visits for times of peak general usage, as Anna said, like parkrun, for example. So really this principle talks about what can bring people to a park, how you can build things that you know women and girls want to see. So for instance, like facilities like cafes, outdoor gyms and circular running tracks, which are something particularly popular with women, is perimeter circular running tracks. But these also need to have good sight lines and be open at regular times so that women can access them easily and know they're going to be open when they need them. It also relates to things like seating. So social seating, we often talk about that's seating that allows people to talk to each other easily. So as opposed to the straight park bench, a circular seat or a rounded seat allows people to face each other and can allow that social contact that women and girls you want to have in parks. And that was something that teenage girls and women both agreed on, but something that you don't see very often, which is interesting because it's something that, perhaps one of the easier things to provide. We also think that active travel is a really useful way to encourage people to shortcut through the park, and we've seen that being quite successful in some cases. So on foot or by bike, linking key destinations through a park can help bring more people to the park, and it's often something that's linked to funding as well. So a way that you can bring funding into the park too. And you can organise specific events and activities. So it's not just about physical features, it's about events bringing women and girls to the park. So these activities need to be in a space which is easy to find and accessible for all. But general activations could also include bringing businesses and schools to the park that are already carrying out activities somewhere else. Why not bring those activities into the park and just activate the space that way? Second, staffing and authority figures. These are official presences such as the police, but not just the police, and these are important by creating a safe space, providing that visible reassurance and as part of wider ways of getting help in parks, which really matter to women and girls. There were differences between how women and girls perceive authority figures. For instance, female park staff and officers were preferable to police. But it's also to do with staff management. And we know that this is costly, but there are ways you can make more of what you've got. For instance, if staff are in parks, it's about having recognisable uniforms, so just a tabard or something that allows the general public to know that that person is an authority figure. Working towards a good gender balance in park staff, providing active bystander training to those staff, and publicising when the park is staffed and where to get help, so that women can make choices. So for instance, having park staff work at least an hour or two after 4 p.m. in winter months, when girls walking home from school and women walking home from work, also helps to have that activation at times when women and girls feel more vulnerable in parks when it starts to get dark. So it's about those working patterns too. We also mention in this chapter about CCTV, what we call technological eyes. So that's CCTV and help points, which is something that women and girls did highlight as something which would be reassuring, but actual people were always preferred to these measures. In the next principle, visibility and openness, it's something that you may be a bit more familiar with if you've looked at secured by design. Its ability to have good sight lines, to see around for a good distance and be seen by others. And these are crucial for a park to feel safe, and were seen as positives in the research that we did. So women and girls disliked areas which were hidden from view and those with thick vegetation, particularly where it obscured key lines of sight. So the simplest way to increase visibility is by managing vegetation along those routes. Tree canopies should be above head height and shrubs below about 1 metre, or space for somebody to crouch, and to plant them back from the main paths and maintain them regularly. And if there isn't enough funding to have everything cut back, it's about choosing where that maintenance is carried out, so around entrances and key points in parks, so that you're not preventing those women from actually getting into the park in the first place by overgrown landscaping. For facilities, it's about having their approaches and entrances visible from a wide area. Next is escape. How easy would it be to escape from a potentially threatening situation? That's something that women and girls routinely evaluate in deciding whether a park feels safe. So high fencing, hedges, locked gates and enclosed areas all make that escape difficult. And it's quite a frightening truth, I think, and it was very a real eye-opener to hear women and girls say that they were doing this. But really, they really are assessing a risk all the time. So some of the things to focus on are those perimeters again and entrances. Teenage girls feel safer at the edges of parks if it's an open park where they can escape. That can be a problem in heritage parks where there are railings, but it's possible sometimes to create those new openings. Paths shouldn't lead to dead ends. Facilities like multi-use games area can be opened up and given more entrances and exits if possible. And there are designs now for multi-use games areas that have a different way of keeping the ball in, so they have a stepped perimeter rather than a fence. So worth considering. In terms of the park layout itself, changes of level or low walls can be used to delineate different spaces rather than higher barriers, which tend to make women and girls feel unsafe. Lighting's very tricky, and we're careful with how we word this in the guidance, but it was something we couldn't miss out because it's very important for many women and girls. The truth is that after dark, parks don't feel good for women and girls. There are few other people around. It's not possible to see and be seen as easily, and it can attract different users and uses to a park. So it's not surprising. It's one of the interventions that some women felt would strongly improve safety and independent use. But it's technical and it's complex, it's expensive, it has a high carbon footprint, and it also affects wildlife. So we recommend seeking expert advice from lighting designers and ecologists. We know that we know certain things. So we know brighter doesn't always mean safer. Bright pooled lights which cause glare can be disorientating, but we know that lighting should allow people, if it's installed, it should allow people walking to see the faces of those approaching and a clear route forward. We know that colour and tone are important, and we know that there's a good argument really for prioritization of certain key routes in parks. It might be a good idea to light, whereas others it's not perhaps good financially, a good decision. So it is a tricky one, but one which we do have a really good case study for in the document. So have a look at that and seek guidance, I think is what we would say on that. Next, we have wayfinding and layout. So women, as Anna outlined, feel safer when they know where they are and how to get to where they're going. So each destination should be visible from the last if possible, and a clear hierarchy of paths is useful, with the most important ones connecting with destinations outside the park and other travel options outside the park too. Signage can help by indicating where those key routes are, and we have a case study on that as well in the document. In terms of the layout of the park, breaking up spaces is important, whether it's the whole park or a facility within the park. So that's especially important for teenage girls, where multiple spaces give opportunities for different groups of women and girls without any feeling like they're pushed out of them. It's important for facilities like multi-use game areas to have options so that one group can't dominate one space. And there are ways of doing that, which we go into in the document. Important to say really that in designing safer parks, we don't want to design boring parks, and because of that, what we really want to do is have lots more women in parks. So we know that it's important to design something that attracts women and girls, and nature itself does that. But so it's important to build things that attract more. Now, into the third theme of inclusion and belonging and familiarity. Feeling that you belong in a space and it's familiar is a really important part of feeling safe for women and girls. Belonging means that you feel welcome. And so if you see someone else like you in the park, you know you belong there. There are things we can do with design, particularly with teenage girls. For instance, providing things in parks that tell them that they're welcome and that they enjoy. So with multi-use game areas and skate parks, they can be signals that to certain groups of teenage boys that they belong there, that they are welcome. But sometimes they don't feel like that for teenage girls. We're not saying that teenage girls don't want to skate and go on a bike park, but we know that not many of them are using these spaces for whatever reason. So they tell us they want to have social seating, like I mentioned with the circular seating, space where they can hang out and chat to their friends. They like hammocks. They want age-appropriate swings. So what we found is that girls love swings, and this is something that I hadn't really appreciated. But they don't feel like they can use the swings that they used to use in the younger children's play area, because there is often a sign up saying that there is age limits, and the parents of the little kids in that area may make them feel like they're not welcome there anymore. So what they really want is swings for older, age appropriate swings for teenage girls, and shelters too. It's all about representation too, so you can represent an area where girls feel they belong with artwork, with co-production of those artworks, by naming of buildings and facilities with names that are sort of more accessible and welcoming to girls and women, by asking the local community how they could be made to feel more welcome. And something which is, again, difficult, but toilets are important for women and girls, and we do need to say that. For them to remain in a space for longer, but also act as a signal that they're welcome, they are important. image and reputation of a park has a big influence on how safe it feels to potential users. Improving public perceptions of a particular park can be hard work and takes time, but there are several ways in which this can be done. So litter and maintenance, this tells women if the park is well maintained, that it's well looked after, and therefore they feel safer. So vegetation around paths, lighting and cameras and signs is important. But also to make sure that signs are still accurate and digital maintenance is done on Google and websites, so that women and girls are more informed about a space. In terms of management, a good gender balance on park committees is useful, and ensuring that it's as easy as possible for women and girls groups to get permission to use the park. For instance, sometimes it's harder for women's teams to get access to football pitches, and it's about kind of making that access as easy as possible. There's something to be said about communications as well, lots of layers to this. If there's a problem or incident, there's a protocol around this. For instance, the London Borough of Greenwich have introduced a public safety protocol for their parks, which details the actions which staff should take for a range of safety issues, from drug detritus to sexual assault. And that aims to ensure that the incident receives a full response in the immediate and longer term, and that the community is reassured. But communication is also about using images and words to show women that they're welcome. And that includes pictures of women and of people doing things, women doing things in the park, including those of diverse groups. Moving on, access and location. Obviously, a safe park on its own is good, but it's not enough, because we need to be able to get there, and we don't always have a choice about where the park is, but we can perhaps enhance the entrances which are closest to the public transport routes, and signpost to safe zones, for example, libraries, shops and schools. And you can also plan parks in the right places where you have that opportunity and privilege. And finally, co-production and engagement. So we've written some guidance which we've based on really robust research, but it can only ever really be general. And whatever you do when you're creating changes to a new park, we think it's really important to engage with them directly and consider intersectionality in that engagement. So the barriers and issues which women and girls face are often specific. Don't just involve their friends group, seek out youth groups, community leaders and faith leaders around, because if you just consult with the friends, you're consulting with people that already come to the park. And what we found in the research is there are lots of people that actually haven't used the parks that are on their doorsteps because of some of these barriers. It doesn't have to be a difficult process. One of the things that one of the activities that's worked well elsewhere are what's called safety works, a great idea from Sweden, where council staff and police officers tour an area with women and girls, just looking at areas around which give them concern and discussing solutions to those. Okay, so that's the principles, the 10 of them. And now we're going to move on back to Anna with some case studies of how some of these principles have been applied.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, so alongside these 10 principles that Helen's just gone through, we collated 10 case studies from the UK and internationally to illustrate at different budgets, different scales, some of how this can be applied in practice. And these are really diverse. Some are on lighting, some are on activation and so forth. But they hopefully give you some inspiration as to what could be done next at different budgets and scales. I haven't got time to talk through them all, so I'm just going to flag a few examples. Next slide, please. So the first one is this example of Burgess Park in South London, which has Helen talked about enhancing the entrances, which had its entrance redesigned so that the exits and entrances are clearly signposted, facilitating escape, but also facilitating that wide visibility you can see there, allowing users to see way into the park before they enter. So this is one of the examples of one of our small box examples within the text. If you move on to the next one. So Helen also pointed out the importance of swings. So what do good swings look like for teenage girls? This is one of our case studies, a great example of Umeå in northern Sweden. So this is one of our citywide case studies. And Umeå has been focusing on gender equality for some decades now. And this is one example of an intervention in a park called Free Zone. And it's where teenage girls worked with architects and artists to create something that would signal belonging to them. And this was the result, really. It was a structure based on a kind of a roundabout with coloured roof lights, with social seating. You can see that there's social seating that actually swing. But also this has been designed to ergonomically designed to suit the teenage girls' bodies, and it hosts Wi-Fi. And there's speakers that you can insert your phone to play music. There's also excellent visibility. You can see there's buildings behind, so there's that passive surveillance that's going on. And it's also a facility that's lit. So you can think about lighting the paths, but you can also think about lighting the facility to extend use of these spaces at certain times. And next slide, please. So this is the example of activation, bringing women into the park. So in a case study in West Yorkshire, in Wakefield, this Empower project was led by a number of CICs, and it involved developing a programme of activities for women with the specific goal of bringing them into parks to make them feel more confident, building up familiarity, but also putting on sessions that extend their physical and mental health. So this range of sessions were designed with the broadest range of women in mind: buggy walks for mothers and carers, TikTok treks for teenage girls, menopause mayhem for older women, mindfulness walks, but also more active classes like boxercise, which was particularly popular, yoga and so forth. So this session of activities were run and they were scheduled throughout the day, including early evening, to reach working women and to extend the times of park use. They were designed to be kind of social and active spaces that through that group, and we talked about actually women feel much safer when they're in parks in organised groups. And this made sure that essentially personal safety wasn't a barrier to participation. So that's a really good case study to have a look at. And we're just going to show you a short clip from this case study that was recorded in our media interviews. So that's just a flavour of some of the case studies. As I said, there's 10 case studies and a host of other smaller examples that you can read about in the guidance. And then we also are really aware of the funding context around parks. We wanted to include alongside each of those 10 principles some quick wins. So these are not only quick, but also they're achievable and low cost issues. And they're a way into thinking and potentially accessing resources to develop some of the larger solutions. So I'm going to hand back to Helen now to talk about next steps.
Thanks, Anna. So next steps for us, sharing the guidance. Obviously, we're sharing that locally, nationally and internationally. So we're doing these presentations quite a lot, and our partners are as well. So we're gradually getting the word out about the guidance. We're trying to find funding to pilot the guidance, and that's something that would be interested to work with you regionally to see if you've got any new parks, for instance, which would be good pilots for the guidance. So we are looking at funding pots for monitoring that those new interventions, but we think probably one of the best ways to find a park to monitor is by working on new parks, because then you've got more you've got a kind of a blank canvas really, but we are doing work trying to find existing parks as well to work on. Further research is a possibility, potentially with the Born in Bradford organisation, for any Bradford colleagues on the call. And we've got a behaviour change campaign about to be launched. We know from our research that many women and girls, although they felt that environmental changes and design changes in parks could have an influence, that obviously the most important and pressing issue for them was to change male behaviour. And so we have published a video which is due to be launched in a week's time, an event in Leeds, and I can share that with you if you're interested. I'll probably, if it's in a week's time, I will just send the link out to it along with any slides and the link to the video of this presentation if you're interested. So thanks for listening. You can find the Green Flag Award, you can find the documents on the Green Flag Award website. Here you can also find them on our website and on the University of Leeds website. And I will just quickly play a little summary video that our colleagues at Green Flag helped us with, which summarises what we've said. Okay, right. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat. So we've got now quarter of an hour if we need it for Q&A, and so we'll have I'll address these, or we can respond to these questions in the chat, and then Stephen's going to do his presentation after that. So there's a question about fencing, so I can take this first, and then Anna, if you want to have a go as well. So fencing and gates around around play areas from a health and safety point of view. So that, I think, so Jonathan and Wynne, you both posted this. I think this refers to younger children's play areas and dogs. I think that's what this is about. And I know from other work that I've done that there is a move away from it in certain play circles because of feelings that one, it doesn't always work, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sometimes people have used it to put dogs inside so the dog doesn't escape, but also there is a question of then it giving the children an idea of that they are not welcome in other areas of the park. So that's, you know, they are protected from, I guess, from dogs, but also I guess it's from toddlers from running away where their parents can't see them. But there is a debate. I know there is a debate in play circles about whether that's the right thing to do. But I would probably say that it doesn't interface with this research too. I think we can align the two, because this is, unless I'm wrong, unless I've got your question wrong, this is about younger children, and we're looking at teenage girls and women in our research. So please come in if I've got that wrong, but I think we can align the two.
Do you want me to actually elaborate on that?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan.
So yeah, all toddler play areas always have a fence around them and a gate around them. What we've got a situation is where we've got some play areas that are very near to major roadways, and we're having a drive by health and safety to actually put gates onto those entrances in and out to those major roadways. That obviously went contrary against the sort of advice that was being suggested, that actually entrances and exits should be nice and easy for free flowing and things like that. So we've got that slight conflict of interest going on. And it's just sort of it's I suppose it's a case of what we find in parks management a lot of time is there's always a more than one view on what should or should not happen. So it's something just to be aware of, that there is areas where we are gating to especially when we've got a lot of parks traditionally are onto pretty major A roads and things like that, because that's where the land was allocated, you know, back in some of them, you know, Victorian era type things. So so that was all. That was what my comment was about. And I say it is guidance. The guidance is from the Royal Society for Prevention Actions that that's what we should do. So I think just need to tie that in with that.
I think, I mean, it does illustrate that we're up against lots of different views, which is what we found. But I think we can align this by saying this is really about areas where smaller children can run into the path of traffic, and this research that we've done is not really about those younger children. It's about teenage girls. So really, if you're going to have a toddler play area that needs to be fenced, I don't think that would really upset our teenage girls and women, because the areas they're likely to want to be in are outside that toddler play area. Anna, have you got anything to add?
And our study was more about the perimeters of the park, so the whole park being kind of fenced rather than play areas in those spaces for younger children. And I think the concern was more about, you know, kind of fences that prevented visibility, and often play area fences are low and often sometimes porous in terms of seeing through. So I don't think it's necessarily a conflict. We're not advocating necessarily for the removal of those fences of play spaces. From a safety perspective.
Absolutely. No, I think
personal perception safety perspective.
Stephen, have you got anything you want to add on that, or any more questions from anyone?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, it's interesting, the perimeter, isn't it? And I think me and you've spoken a little bit about this, and I always use the example of Vondel Park in Amsterdam, a park that sort of, I guess, 10 years ago, when I used to take, you know, the university used to take students over, it was quite a scary place. It wasn't somewhere that teenage girls and young women used to, you know, want to hang out in. It's actually a very naturalistic park as well, interestingly enough, because there's lots of conversations about, you know, maintaining nature and what's the fine line. And I'm very much a design by nature kind of a designer. In terms of Vondel Park, I think one of the changes that happened is the perimeter wild and natures was taken down or cut back a bit. So like you said in yours, you could see into the park, you could see into the spaces. And I sat there for a while, you know, once students had gone, and it was 9 o'clock at night. And there was, you know, teenage girls, young women sat under the light reading books 9 o'clock at night, cycling through. And so I think the perimeters is a really important thing. And I'm always an advocate for nature, obviously, and cutting things back. I'm also an experiential, immersive designer. I worked in the theme park industry, so I'm all about being immersed in nature. But there is that fine line. And I think the perimeters is an important thing to look at in terms of opening up the visibility in and out. And Vondel Park's still got wild, intimate spaces. For those you know what I'm talking about. But the fact that you can see in from the outside and the street lights shining, I think that possibly made a massive difference in turning that park around in terms of safety. There is also presence, so therefore, the more presence, the safer it felt.
Mm-hmm.
There was young women doing yoga and reading on their own under the lights in the park, and I'm not sure I've seen that anywhere yet. Parks in the UK. So,
Thank you.
I was there just a few months ago, Stephen, and very good active travel through the parks as well. So constant presence. There's quite a lot of kiosks and different areas in parks, and it did seem to be actually quite well staffed. So yeah, I think learning points.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, unless we've got any more questions, we have some time after Stephen's presentation for questions as well, so there might be things that that come up by then. So let's move on with your presentation, Stephen, if that's okay, if you want to share.
okay, let me just share my screen.
And thank you for your comment, Emma. That's helpful.
Just let me know, can you see my screen, everybody?
Not yet.
No, just share. Let's just. Sorry, don't know what's up with that. Let's try again. Share. Doesn't seem to want to share my screen.
I can do it for you if you like.
Can you?
I can. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what's
have it.
happening there. I've got
I
it
have
already
it in
up.
reserve.
Right,
Just in
right,
case.
Brilliant. That's what we like. Be prepared for the issues.
Okay. Is that working?
Yeah, can we do full?
Oh yeah, can do.
Yeah. So while we're just loading up, just for those of you that have our paths haven't crossed before, so I'm Steve Howard. I'm the active design manager for Yorkshire Sport Foundation. Interesting position really, how I've ended up here. I'm a landscape architect by trade. I worked in practice for several years, including in China on park master plan design. Initially in the theme park industry in Orlando, so recreational park design. And then 16 years as an academic teaching landscape architecture, urban design at Leeds Met, Leeds Beckett, before taking on the role in 2019 as active design manager. And I wasn't 100% sure what that meant, except the brief was it was looking at parks design, master plans, looking at active transport, health and well-being through nature. I have to say, I know very little about sport. I'm not your typical sportsman, but I am really interested in spatial design. That's obviously crossed over to design, inclusivity, etc., and takes us to, I guess, the agendas that we're talking about today. So around the same time as Helen and Anna started their research, we were also talking to our friends and partners at Make Space for Girls. And Sport England also released statistics in terms of health, well-being, you know, active physical activity, and particularly around young women and teenage girls. And Yorkshire came out as one of the worst in terms of the stats for teenage girls, young women being physically active, etc. So for me, in terms of looking at spatial design, obviously, you know, that there's an opportunity there to look into this a bit further, as it was for obviously Helen and Anna. So our colleagues at Make Space for Girls, you know, we all know lots of the issues, you know, and you know, landscape design, urban designs, we're all trained for many years, been looking at parks. I work with the police on community projects with the students. You know, we probably knew that things like lighting, clean toilets, the things that we know have probably been taken away from our parks would come up as an issue, and subsequently in both of our pieces, those things played a part. So why make space for us? Well, we initially obviously speaking to make space for girls, who, you know, is geared around young women, teenage girls. However, lots of other demographics in terms of gender minorities were coming back to us and saying, actually, we don't feel safe in the spaces either. And funny enough, some, you know, quite a lot of groups of boys said, well, we actually don't feel safe either. So we decided to call our piece Make Space for Us. We also thought it's important that boys and teenage boys and young men are a really important part of this conversation, as was highlighted in Helen. So we wanted, you know, the boys and that to be part of some of this conversation as well. Okay, next slide, Helen, please. So obviously this is a substantial report. I'm just going to quickly go through some of the main points of it. I have put the link online, and as anything else, you know, it's probably a full webinar in itself, but I'm just going to highlight a few things. So there is an executive summary. So I'll just go through that quickly before I go into the intro of actually what came out of it. And again, there's some crossovers, which Helen and I both knew would happen in terms of our outcomes. So first of all, parks need to provide clean, cared for, attractive spaces. They need to promote physical activity, emotional safety. Again, you know, we kind of probably knew some of these things would come out. Developing spaces where harassment, scrutiny and judgments minimised, crucial. Equalising promoting usage of specific exercise spaces for girls. Purposeful activity and organised opportunities. Creating playful, exciting, adventurous ways to get active. And one of the key things on there is that the teenage girls and young women shaping the activities and the designing of the spaces is really, really important. Next slide, please, Helen. So
sorry.
It's okay, no worries. We looked at, in particular, we took three parks. Yorkshire Sport Foundation, we're South and West Yorkshire. We've got 9 districts. So we looked at many of our parks, we talked to our partners, and we ended up using 3 pilot parks to conduct our research. We worked with Women in Sport, so Women in Sport conducted the activities, the workshops, obviously with us supporting to create that research. So we wanted to understand how teenage girls use the parks and green spaces within these communities around these 3 parks, and we based it. We based them on Ellesmere Park in Sheffield, Greensborough Park in Rotherham, and Holroyd Park in Kirklees. These 3 very different spaces, very different regimes of maintenance, or some needing quite, you know, a lot of regeneration, some quite well maintained. Different communities that we were obviously in touch with around those parks, including many groups, including our Southern Asian communities we spoke to, or Somali teenage girls. So a real range and diverse groups of teenage girls and women that we spoke to across those 3 districts. Next slide, please, Helen. So what we wanted to do is identify the barriers and challenges teenage girls faced, particularly around these parks, uncover untapped opportunities to encourage greater park and green space use, particularly obviously geared around teenage girls, but not solely, and understand the need for the youth voice and consultation on the parks and green spaces agendas. Okay, next slide, Helen, please. So in terms of the methodology, it was sort of split into 4 parts, again with some real creative workshops and ways to gather material from our friends and colleagues at Women in Sport. So initially, and this again back in 2021, gathering the research of parks and kinds of observations, initial stakeholder engagement, and again our stakeholders covered a wide range of local authority, parks departments, designers, practitioners, community group leaders, etc. But part 2, the more quantitative surveys, that's just going into the schools, the groups, you know, again linking with our partners and some of the schools and youth groups around those parks and within those communities. February, March 22, more exploration of the teenage girls' experiences. Again, you know, more creative exploration and gathering that voice from our teenage girl groups involved. And then back in May 22, a larger stakeholder immersive innovative workshop, again bringing back stakeholders, people in charge of the design of the parks, the maintenance, some planners, a whole range, to sort of come up with I guess, you know, some innovative outputs from this and where we could take this project next. Next slide, please, Helen. Okay, so I'm not going to go through obviously all the stats, some really interesting stats. Some of them we obviously probably could have foreseen. Again, it probably is going to be obvious to us that in terms of activity levels, the girls are going to be less active to the boys. It's interesting, again, there's lots of quotes and things from the girls of why that might be. Again, some crossovers, as Helen said, you know, a lot of the girls were very active in their primary years and they get to secondary school and that kind of phases out. So therefore, there's an opportunity there to engage more. And a full range of interesting outcomes. Some of them, I guess we knew, and some of them that we didn't. Next slide, please, Helen. Yeah, again, obvious that boys tend to be more sporty. We know, again, from our colleagues at Make Space for Girls, etc., that, you know, and particularly, you know, I was conscious in terms of my work in parks that a lot of the physically active spaces are geared up for boys. Girls don't feel that they're part of that they're invited. Again, the importance of really engaging with boys and young men, teenage boys, and this was really important as well. Again, just, you know, I'm not going to go through all the stats, but 3 in 10 girls say they're sporty. 5 in 10 girls said they used to be sporty compared to 3 in 10 boys. 76% of girls would like to be more fit and active. So, you know, we've got opportunities there that, you know, we didn't have the stats, but now we've got the stats to really kind of look at some of these opportunities. Next slide, please, Helen. And there's many sort of pages of you know, of the outcomes from those consultations. Okay, so park usage, attitudes, perceptions. Next slide, please, Helen. So again, perceptions, but and again some crossovers again from both our research. Lack of basic facilities and maintenance. Again, the lighting issue come up. Clean toilets for teenage girls and young women, young mums. Is always going to come up as an issue. Lack of knowledge and opportunities to get active with others. Fear of physical and emotional safety, of course, which feeds right back into Helen's amazing piece of research. And others. Lack of belonging, confidence to claim the space. So these are just a few of the key perceptions, and there was many more which are listed in the outcomes. Next page, please. So Women in Sport use the combi model. Those of you familiar with that, those of you not, this is about behaviour change and how we encourage behaviour change, capability, opportunity and motivation in order to address the barriers or I guess sort of in terms of the facilitators to create some sort of resilience. So we use that combi model in terms of looking at and talking about how we could create that behaviour change with teenage girls and young women that we worked with. Next page, please. So opportunities to engage, and obviously, you know, this is funded by Sport England, but as we know now, you know, the tides have changed quite a lot. The fact that active design is part and parcel of the conversations, the language is changing, that it's not just about sport as we know it, it's about physical activity, it's about access to nature, it's about anything that encourages people outdoors. And this is one of the things that we had to do with our parks. This is about, firstly, we've got to get the people into the parks. It's not just, you know, the activity. We've got to create change that actually gets our teenage girls and young women into the parks to start with. Next page, please. So this is some of, again, just some of the outputs and outcomes from, you know, the workshops, etc. Just, you know, important, a few of them, technology come up, you know, being able to charge your phone, being able to tell and said to if there's any problem that you can get help and support. The girls were really interested in why, you know, if our phone dies and we're in a park, how are we supposed to get help? And that was interesting. By the way, none of this was promoted by us. You know, this is all came from the Girls' Voice, and all of our communities, all the demos we spoke to, all wanted nature well-being to be part of their life. They wanted to be closer to nature. However, they were kind of always afraid of nature too, which comes back to, I guess, that maintenance, Helen, of the landscape and how we manage that and that fine line. They wanted to be able to bring, you know, we're talking about female. So here they wanted to bring their mums and their siblings into the park and share it together, but they didn't feel like them culturally that was possible. Other cultural barriers that I wasn't initially aware of, for example, dogs. You know, dogs in parks was a cultural barrier for some of the groups we spoke to. And I wasn't, you know, I'm a dog walker, I wasn't aware of that. So there's lots of interesting, you know, results came from engaging with the communities here. The space should be socially for everybody, and they didn't feel like that. Again, you know, I could go on and on about all of those, but some obvious, some maybe not so. Next slide, please. Conscious of time. So 8 principles for success that we sort of put together that came out of this. You know, 1, no judgment. 2, evoke excitement. 3, clear emotional reward. 4, open the eyes to what's there. 5, build into existing habits. 6, give girls a voice and a choice. 7, champion what's in it for them. And 8, expand the image of what sporty can look like. And again, I'm a real champion of that. You know, it's not just big group sport, it's not big field sport, it's actually activities, you know, that span anything from dance and anything more creative. And I'm really a champion in, you know, those aspects of physical activity in the work that I do. Next slide, please. So the recommendations, and again, there's a whole list of recommendations, but just to go through, you know, involve teenage girls in shaping the parks and the communities that they live in. Create very exciting, innovative spaces to support girls to get active and to get there to start with. Facilitate organised opportunities, community events that the girls can enjoy with their families. Reframe perceptions of parks as active spaces for in terms of for everyone, and share learnings and good practice. And one of the things to come out of this is, you know, I've been really inspired. Obviously, I worked with undergraduates and young people at the university. Some of these images are from some of the projects, but also working with our colleagues at Jump and Born in Bradford and working with teenage girls in Bradford there, where I brought in some of my graduates from practice and we made models and you know, so actually blown away by some of the amazing creative ideas, and they know what they want, you know, so giving them the voice and making sure they're part of the design process is crucial. Next slide, please. So we held a work. We also put together a summary from the workshop. Next slide, please. And the outcome of this, really, the objectives were to support the stakeholders, I guess, in sort of these ideas and agendas. So giving the stakeholders a sense of ownership and shared purpose. The stakeholders could feel inspired and enthused to be the catalyst for change in this. To gather insight to support the successful implementation of projects, to understand how stakeholders might use the research and have input into the project, and challenge stakeholders' thinking and inspire new ways of collaborative working in the future proofing of spaces. So again, we had colleagues from groundwork and other practices, we had planners, we had parks, you know, the parks maintenance team, and we all came together. And it was a really great event, really creative. And again, obviously, your guide, Helen, is you know, an integral part. It's on my design library bookshelf. It's kind of with all of, you know, my creative design books. It's a really useful and exciting design. We needed to have that that design guide, I think, there for us all to use. Next slide, please. So again, in terms of just in brief, innovation outcomes. So working on the 3 problem opportunity briefs provided, stakeholders produced 73 seed ideas. We asked them to come up with ideas, just initial seed ideas. They were put into groups. They had to present some of those seed ideas. So little nuggets of inspiration that could be used, adapted, merged to build and optimize ideas. We then asked them to pick 3 broad starter ideas, so little foundation ideas to work from that maybe needed refining, optimizing. And then finally, they had to present their optimized ideas, which, you know, was all sorts of interesting things and ideas, thinking outside the box. And again, some of those you can see in the outcomes summary workshop. You know, ultimately to engage teenagers, you know, that was what we wanted. So again, a bit about exercise in parks, opportunities, innovation, facilitate opportunities to enjoy activity with family and friends, build on leverage existing habits, behaviours, and use tech innovatively. This is obviously our outcomes workshop and what, you know, they were taking from the results from the teenage girls. Inspire discovery of new exciting activity experiences, build formative memories, create opportunities to help the girls feel good about themselves, challenge pride, and reframe parks as time well spent, connection to nature and well-being. And obviously our colleagues and partners took all of this away, hopefully back to their organisations, etc. And next slide, please. So problems, brief, ideas and solutions. Again, this is where we now, you know, where this piece of work stands is I'm working hard to try and get funding now, again, like Helen, to look at those pilot spaces and start to implement some of these spatial design changes with our partners within those 3 pilot parks, and hopefully to disseminate that over the wider area. There needs to be some more workshops where we bring, again, the community teams back in then to really help guide the design of those spaces within their own communities and their own parks. And one of the, I've put the plug and play there. Plug and play was a really interesting idea that I went to look at in Copenhagen. And it's where developers, and this is where, you know, we need to bridge the gaps, developers give over their land while a planning process is going on, prior to building anything, and allowed the local authority, the landscape teams to put in spaces for physical activity, for play. And plug and play was a really interesting part of that, and a way to you know, where just by allowing that land to be used pre the development. And we saw some really interesting kind of case studies there, and some of them are on the images on the final pages. If you just go to the next slide, please. So again, just there was lots of interest. We asked our stakeholders for pledges at the end, pledges for change, and some of them are listed there. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they are all listed again in the documents, so that our stakeholders took away those pledges for change. We obviously have listed them in our documents. We're still chatting to obviously our partners and colleagues about sort of moving this forward. Next slide, please. As I say, what's next? So as I say, funding to get some of these ideas developed to the next stage to put into these spaces, these pilot parks, as our initial 3 spaces to start to make that change. As Helen said, it's always easier from a brand new master plan to put these interventions in rather than retrofitting. But those 3 parks, we chose them because there were opportunities spatially with partners that were, you know, willing to make those changes, and obviously to sort of watch this space a little bit for where we take that next. Next page, please, Helen. Just conscious of time, so I'm going to freeze. So I've just dropped in. I'm not going to go through all of them. I've dropped in from my vast archive of taking students to Copenhagen, to Amsterdam. Some of them are from show gardens we've done. Some of them show seating, spatial design. Some of them are from public exhibitions of undergraduate work. I've got a huge archive. Many of you might have seen some of those images at some of the events that I've done. So I've just thrown them in there. If there's anything in particular anyone's interested in, and again, it's things that Helen's looked at, the seating, give, you know, the design of spaces, the colours, the imagery, you know, that enables teenage girls, young women to take some ownership again of those spaces as well. So yeah, I'll finish there, and just to say, there's many more of them, which again, as the other events unfold, you know, I will obviously present. There's a whole webinar probably on each of those park designs. But anyway, I'll hand back to you, Helen.
Thank you.
A quick sweeping kind of run through that.
I probably didn't give you enough time, Stephen, but that is a really useful introduction to your study. And I hope that it shows that the two studies align very well. And what stood out to me there really was kind of issues of confidence, pride and belonging that came out of your study, but also that girls want to be in parks, they want to be more active, and you know, so it's just so important to remove some of those barriers. So thank you very much. We only have 5 more minutes, and so I'm just going to check in the chat whether we have anything else to look at. I don't think so, except for a nice comment from Adele. Thank you. So I guess how we'll leave that then is just I will follow up with an email with our slides, and Stephen, if you want to forward yours, that would be useful. I'll send you the link on the YouTube channel and the behaviour change campaign. But really just it's an appeal to you, the audience, if you are looking to work on parks and want to start a conversation, we are looking for those pilots to test the guidance. So it'd be really interesting to hear from you. Our doors are open, so please get in touch. Okay, I don't think there's any more comments. So amazing. We're going to finish a few minutes ahead of schedule. Thank you very much to Dr. Anna Barker and Stephen Hayward for presenting with me, and see you all very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.